on the economy, Joe Scarborough, we have that, right, Tony? Was he on Bill? What do you have first? You got that? This is Scarborough. It's just a quick thing on Bill Maher. And when he details these various economic achievements or where we are economically, it's sort of in stark contrast to the vibe we have and the way that the economy has floated to the surface with sort of the dissatisfaction of the American electorate. Go ahead, play a little bit of it.
And it drives me crazy when I hear politicians talking about how bad things are in America. We've got a $26 trillion GDP. China, which was supposed to overtake us 10 years ago, remember that? They're like stuck at 17, 18 trillion. California, which is supposed to be a socialist state, has a bigger GDP, fourth biggest GDP in the world, bigger than India's, bigger than Britain's, bigger than Canada's. Texas has a bigger GDP than Russia. I mean, it's incredible relative to the rest of the world. And that's the only way we can measure this. Our economy is stronger today than any time since World War II.
Yep.
And so much of that has to do, nobody's saying that. Maybe it's because nobody gets elected by saying how great this country's economy is. But it's not just the tech sector, which is great, but it's also small businesses.
Yeah.
It's what's happening on Main Street. It's entrepreneurs. It's people that
It's our nature.
It's people.
We're greedy, and it's good.
Do you know the great?
Okay, now that's that you can. I mean, I get it. That the triumph of capitalism or whatever. I can have that argument about unfettered capitalism, but more to the message, Gary, because you're so good at like why these things don't bubble up. You really can't. They alluded to it. You can't win elections saying, "Hey, I know it may not feel great, but it's actually really great."
Yeah. I mean, this has always been the conundrum for somebody running for president. Okay, it is almost ubiquitous. I mean, you go clear back. I remember back to 1988. People are like, "What are you talking about?" Yeah, George Bush running, and he was. And he was just like, hey, wait a minute. I know that George Bush Sr., remember? I know that the numbers don't seem that good, but, they really are good. Aren't you feeling it? Because the stock market, this and that. This is always the challenge, Mark. The stock market, as we speak today, is at record levels, right? I mean, we did go down a lot of metrics, but the challenge is always this. How does it affect Mr. and Mrs. going to the gas station, going to the grocery store, all of that? It's the day-to-day experience of people. Maybe it's job losses for certain people. Maybe it's threats for certain people who are in the auto industry in Detroit, whatever it might be. But particularly, as you know, Mark, it just seems like in this election cycle, it has been literally impossible for the Biden-Harris campaigns, first the Biden campaign, then the Harris campaign, to move people off of the experience of inflation. That has been the number one issue that people just can't get beyond whenever there's conversations about the economy. The price of a loaf of bread, the price of gas, whatever it is, that has always been in every focus group the driving factor. It doesn't matter what you can compare economy to economy internationally. You can look at the stock market, but that seems to be in every focus group what people say they're experiencing and what they're upset about.
Yeah, this is interesting too. That it probably I see it in the chat. On some level, it probably does correspond to the cost of rent, the cost of homes, these big ticket items too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I say inflation, I'm talking about that writ large, right? Housing. I mean, even automobile prices, which soared, as you know, around COVID. Now, a lot of this is related to supply chain issues during COVID. That was for food products. That was for automobile parts, et cetera. So a lot of it happened around COVID, as we all know, double-digit inflation, which Americans had not experienced since you got to go back to the Jimmy Carter era in the late 70s to experience something like that. So that's why this was so, and continues to be, so jarring for the American people. And you can talk about inflation having reduced, as you well know, Mark, down to around 2.5% annually now. But the problem is those prices, those inflation numbers that went up over the last 3 or 4 years, of course, have not come down significantly. That's what people are upset about.
I want you to now watch a little something. Again, these are bits of video that have information that I'd love your comment on when we get done. Go ahead, Tony. This is this is polling stuff, but it relates to attitude, which is why I wanted you to hear it. Go ahead.
It is a tie game here weeks before the election, and it's that shift. Our last poll taken in the wake of that September debate, Harris had opened up that advantage over Trump. Gone in our new poll. What goes into that? What's behind that? I think this one is revealing. This is the basic perception voters have of these candidates. Is it positive? Is it negative? Now, these are not great numbers for either one. Trump 43 positive, 51 negative. He's 8 points underwater, you might say. But look at Harris. Exact same positive score and that negative number almost in the exact same place. And this is it. The last time we polled this question after that debate, Harris had really made up ground in this area. Look, she had a positive rating, 48 to 45. So that advantage has all in the last few weeks in our poll washed away for her. Then there's some issues, some characteristics here. These are advantages in red here that you see for Trump now versus September. On the immigration and the border, we ask voters, who would be better on this? In September, Trump had a big advantage. It's gotten bigger. On inflation and the cost of living, Trump's advantage now hits double digits. And on the question of who represents change, Harris had the advantage in September. She still does, but lower.
So significant because voters are telling us change is a critical issue for them, not the direction you want to be going in there, Steve.
No, absolutely not. And maybe a reason for that, too.
Yeah. So important there. Takeaway is trending, which I always sort of look at. And I know you do as well. I mean, I may have even gotten the idea to focus on it from you. But the idea somehow that the trends are positive for Trump, Kamala Harris, while still leading, even in that category of change, is trending down. What do you take from that stuff?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Mark. I mean, you can look at the high water marks for Kamala Harris and her ticket. They were when Biden stepped aside and she got the nomination from her party, when she had, by all accounts, a pretty strong convention. By the way, most people thought the Republicans did too. But of course, the third one was when most general observers thought she really did a sound job in that one debate that they had. Those were her high watermarks. But the problem has been some of those underlying issues. And that's what Steve Kornacki was getting at there with those numbers. And you see it, Harry Enton's doing the same thing for CNN, same kind of analysis. The problem has been once you got past those event-driven high water marks, then those underlying issues like inflation, the economy that we just talked about, like immigration, even things like change, it's been very difficult, as you know, in the last few weeks for Kamala Harris to enunciate any ways that she would be significantly different from Biden and his presidency. Those underlying issues, therefore saying she's not really a change candidate, that's the implication there. Those underlying issues have begun to resurface. And this is what pollsters are talking about. Look, you can have event-driven impacts on polls, but those deep undercurrents, what do voters say they care about? Those have been steady throughout this year of inflation / the economy, immigration / the border. Those have been the biggest drivers in all the polls, and those are now sort of coming home to roost. And that's why you're seeing those Harris numbers begin to drop off.
Comments like this, climate change and abortion are not non-issues, says Sandy. It is weird how these significant women's reproductive freedoms and their freedoms to do what they want with their own body. And it's remarkable that that's kind of been busted down. Like, you don't hear a lot about it in the media right now. Just as we even reviewed the weekend's events, it's, he's at McDonald's and doing his, the theater of running, and she's hammering now about Trump. I don't think she does, Kamala Harris, touch on women's reproductive freedoms, but it feels as though the media has blown by it on their way to economy and border, which I think the Republicans have successfully made the focus of this campaign.
Well, I think the thing about that, Mark, I want to be really clear. It's not that abortion, climate change, and even people, oftentimes talk about the future of democracy, et cetera, when it relates to Trump. It's not like those are unimportant issues, especially to certain segments of the voters. But time and poll after poll after poll, across the political spectrum, have said, yes, they're there, but they're in the B drawer. Okay, in terms of I'm not saying that. Voters are saying that, right? I mean, over and over and over again. And you go back to the classic Clintonian, quote unquote, it's the economy, stupid. Every presidential cycle, this is documented, the single most important issue to voters is the economy, pocketbook issues. After that, if they're feeling good about those, then they'll go to other issues, more secondary issues. Now, I don't say secondary in a qualitative way. I'm saying that in a poll-driven, focus group, ascertained way. Voters have said this cycle that those issues of the economy, inflation, and the border/immigration are their number one and number two. And then you get to abortion/reproductive rights, the environment/climate, democracy, et cetera. That's just the facts, and everybody knows them. And I think that's the reason why, Mark, that the media is focusing on those top two issues, because that's what they've been hearing in their own polling of voters this entire cycle.
Interesting. So they're following what they're hearing is the appetite and what is polling among voters. Play the second. This is a little longer. This is from that. She does the Cook Report, I think. I forget her name. I'm sorry, you probably know her. But anyway, it's not so much who she is, except for the fact that she's articulating an interesting, and I thought this was a revelation, an interesting polling fact, data point within the overall polling. So I know there's a lot of things, dead heat, what can you know? One poll, everything's within the margin of error. But there's one thing here, and she polls both Republican and Democratic pollsters, working with both of them, in swing states, a subcategory that could be decisive. Go ahead, Tony.
We've had 3 different polls. We're doing them with BSG, the Benenson Strategy Group, a Democratic polling firm, and GS Strategy Group, which is a Republican firm. And these guys have been fantastic partners, in part because they both work in states that are purple or sometimes in states that aren't friendly to their side. So they appreciate a real swing state. But what we did is we broke up the overall electorate in those 7 states into basically 3 buckets. One being people who've shown up in the last 4 elections. And what we know about people who show up in election after election is they're going to show up in this election, right? If you voted in 4 out of the last 4 elections, there's a 90+% chance you're showing up in this election, as long as you're physically able to do so. The next, and by the way, that group of voters, that's somewhere around 60% of the electorate, right? So they're the biggest share, but just over a majority. And then another 30-ish% fall into the category. They voted in anywhere from 1 to 3 of the last 4 elections. And then the final bucket, which is the smallest bucket, are people who said they've registered since 2022. So they weren't able to vote in any of those 4 elections. Now, the one consistent from May through this last poll we did in September is those most engaged voters were voting for the Democrat, whether that's Biden or Harris, by 4 points. And that goes to kind of the makeup of that electorate, which we know it's an older group. It is whiter than average, right? It's less diverse than the overall electorate. And it's probably going to be more college educated than the overall electorate. And these are the voters that are propelling and have propelled Democrats to success in 2018, in 2020, but certainly most notably in 2022.
Great, thank you. That's all I needed to hear. Now, that's a great fact, I thought, Gary. The idea somehow that now they're breaking down those voters they're polling into these subgroups, and the ones who have voted in the last 4 elections will vote in this election, and that favors Democrats by 60%, she was saying.
Yeah, I think the important thing to make the distinction between a presidential election cycle and what we call an off-year cycle, which is the midterm election cycle. That's 2022 and 2018. 2020 and 2016, of course, are presidential election cycles. And we always see larger turnout, Mark, obviously, in presidential cycles than we do in midterms. And the so-called, we call them in politics the always voters, the sometimes voters, and the never voters, okay? The always voters that she referred to first, they vote in midterm elections. But the sometimes voters often do not. They will make sure in a presidential race they are out, they cast their ballot. But midterms, yeah, they might not, okay? So I think that's the important thing for people to take away from that, is that we are now in a not only a presidential cycle, but I think most of us observers would say a hyper-involved presidential cycle, and we know that. You look at people who say, yeah, I'm definitely going to vote this time. Those numbers are through the roof. So I think we're going to have a high turnout. Most pollsters believe that. And what does that do? That somewhat negates any advantage that a party might have between the always, sometimes, and even never voters, because this election cycle, people are turning out. We even know that from the early turnout numbers in states like Georgia and North Carolina that people are monitoring because of the impacts of the hurricane. I mean, some record early turnout. So I think it's going to be real interesting to see what happens. And some of those prior cycles, especially trying to compare in the midterms, are not going to be as valuable this time around, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. In fact, you anticipated something that I was thinking and was going to ask you about. And that is that, yeah, in the midterms, because she even noted and underscored 2022, the midterms are way different. That's when that animated voting block shows up, and then they show up disproportionate to those who just show up for the presidential elections, as you were just saying. So I was really going to ask you about this, because it seems to me like these Trump voters, they're there for Trump. Trump wasn't on the ballot in 2022. So don't talk to me about everybody who showed up in 2022, because Trump wasn't on it. And that's why the Democrats had this, very impressive showing, I would suggest, in large measure. And as you've just noted, but those Trump voters are going to show up because Trump is the ballot as far as they're concerned. I don't even know that they'll vote on any down ticket stuff.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, people might find this crazy, but it's true. There's a lot of people who just vote for the presidency, and that is it. I mean, they won't even vote for a U.S. Senate candidate, House candidate, but boom, they'll vote for the presidency. I think you're making a really important point about 2022. 2022 was unique in two regards. One, Trump had lost just 2 years earlier, and he was not on the ballot, okay? He was not on the ballot. And secondly, the Democratic-leaning voters were very animated because of the SCOTUS decision, right? I mean, we know that. All the polling has showed that. And so the question, and Democrats are wondering this themselves, will even all of their people that turned out in 2022, are they as animated this time around for Kamala Harris as they were in the immediate aftermath of that abortion decision by the Supreme Court?
Then I get this from Rex in the chat. He says, meh, a lot of his younger male voters, meaning Trump's younger male voters, aren't registered. I watched a podcast and the guy wasn't even registered, Rex says. There is a lot of smack talk out there. It's funny, Gary, you've got this, as I say, he's almost like a character of theater, Donald Trump. He shows it. And I've talked to many journalists who've covered his rallies. I mean, recently, and have through the campaigns. We have one who joins us regularly on Friday, Michael Shore, and he says in talking to people, his sense is people are there for the show. They're not there for policy. They're not there to hear Trump on anyone. They're there for the show. They love the call and response. They love his show. He's a showman. That's really his thing. But as was just noted by Rex, many of those people, on the other hand, may not go to the poll. They may not even register, some of those young guys.
Well, here's an interesting conundrum. Here's an interesting dynamic in that I'm sure sociologists and political scientists are going to be writing about for the next decade plus. It's been Democrats, of course, that have really pushed for same-day voter registration. I mean, they want access to the ballots, so they pushed that really hard. One of the ironies may be that some of these, MAGA-wearing hat guys, come in and say, hey, and they're like, hey, you know what, Joe, you're not on the roll here. And they're like, well, dadgum, I thought I was. I'm just having fun with an accent.
That's exactly right.
I'm not trying to imply anything. Well, ma'am, that's very interesting. But do you know what, Joe? You can register right now. Oh, okay, great, fantastic. I think I'll do that. So, I think the dynamics of this thing are getting so fuzzed up. I think it's going to be truly remarkably interesting to see how all of this eventually plays out. Who's registered? Who turns out? Who didn't turn out? Who's turning out for the first time? I mean, Democrats have made a big push just in the last few weeks for younger voters, but they are notoriously not great at showing up and actually voting, even if you do register them. So I mean, right now, here is, and I hope people hear this today. We are in absolute no man's land in terms of polling. We have never seen polling this close within the margin of error in all the battleground states and nationally in all of modern polling. And so this is truly going to come down to two things, Mark. One is, how motivated is your side to actually turn out? You've got to energize them, keep them motivated for the next 15 days, and get them to turn in a ballot. And secondly, the so-called GOTV efforts. Who is going to be successful in IDing those who've actually turned in ballots and then who actually still need to turn them in and get them to the polls? That's where we are now.
That is so well put. Gary, thank you always. I love listening to your takes. It's funny, I take all this stuff in and I go, God, I've got to talk to Dietrich about this on Monday. And so we appreciate your visits. Gary Dietrich can be found across the CBS television network and the CBS television stations across California and beyond, and of course on iHeartRadio as their political analyst, and here with us on Mondays. Thanks a lot, Gary Dietrich. Gary Dietrich, everybody.
The Mark Thompson Show.
Gary Dietrich's segment is brought to you by Bill Campbell at Remax Gold. Thank you for sponsoring Gary so he could join us. If you're relocating into or from Northern California, you do need a highly respected real estate professional. Bill Campbell is that professional. Remax Gold with Bill Campbell. Call or text Bill if you want. 530-448-7474. 530-448-7474. Thanks again, Bill Campbell of Remax Gold, for bringing us Gary Dietrich. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.